So thank you for joining us. Today we're talking about understanding climate data and resources for climate adaptation for Region 3 forests. This is part of a project with the Forest Service Region 3 in partnership with the Ecological Restoration Institute. My name is Bryce Esch. I am a program coordinator for the Ecological Restoration Institute at NAU. And if you're not familiar with ERI, I will keep this very short because I don't want to get into the weeds, but we are a research institute at Northern Arizona University working on a number of things, but one of our primary focuses is providing science to land managers, and that's one of my primary functions. And that's primarily what we're doing today. So just to give you a brief overview and a welcome, this is our agenda for today. I think most of you will have seen this already from the event invite. We're going to start with this brief welcome and an overview for the meeting, and then we'll have a handful of presentations from researchers and practitioners, folks working for the Forest Service and thinking about climate in the Southwest. And then hopefully we'll have a little bit of time for discussion, and then we'll finish up with next steps, and we should be done by 3. I just wanted to remind you all, because these big group meetings online can be a little bit unwieldy, we're asking everyone to stay on mute unless you're presenting, but please feel free to contribute questions, comments, and ideas in the chat. We will have time at the end for presenters to answer questions. So you can type those in real time, but we will move through those presentations relatively quickly and then have time at the end for everyone to address questions. So, so just a moment on, the purpose and the goals of this meeting. We here at ERI, and I think that a lot of folks within the agency as well hear from their colleagues and people they work with that folks are aware of climate impacts, aware of things that are happening. They know there's a wealth of resources on climate, but you don't necessarily have time to sort through it all or to make a call about what the best science is. So this particular meeting is part of a larger project in partnership with ERI and the Forest Service in Region 3 to help provide some of that science and guidance and tools to folks on the ground with respect to climate adaptation. So our goals for this meeting in particular are to share some of that science on climate adaptation with you, and then also to help this project and to move it forward, to gather input from you on what will be most useful. So we're hoping that you learn some today, and then that helps shape where we take this and informs some of the decisions we make about the outcomes for the project. So I would like to introduce Anita Rose. She is the Region 3 Air and Climate Coordinator to talk briefly a little bit about the context from the Forest Service point of view.
All right, thank you, Bryce. As Bryce said, I am the Regional Air Program Manager and Climate Change Coordinator. I'm really happy to see so many people joining us. We're up to just over 70 right now, so this is great. I've been in the region since January and have spent a lot of time getting up to speed and really have focused a lot on the scorecard, which, the latest iteration came out this year. And now it's kind of time to turn our focus more back onto the framework and making some headway into developing a management strategy and some adaptation strategies and techniques. Now, for those who aren't aware, back in 2009, the Forest Service did create the Office of Sustainability and Climate. And since that time, they've been working on developing things like this framework that they've provided, as well as the scorecard, which the two dovetail really nicely with one another. And, you know, some of this stuff is happening in parallel. Bryce, if you want to go ahead and go to the next slide. And so, you know, a lot of this is happening in parallel. And we're going to talk about vulnerability assessments that have already been done in the region. There are still more that we could do and probably will do, but we're moving more into having a focus on what is our overall management strategy, what are our goals, and eventually, you know, developing some adaptation strategies and techniques that folks on the ground can actually use to address some of the issues related to climate change that we're seeing. And I think, Bryce, if you want to click forward just a couple more. I know we've got some animation there. And really, we want your input on these things. We don't
a little too far.
Okay, thank you. We don't want to go off with, you know, and develop something that isn't useful. And really, that's what this is all about, is trying to boil down a lot of the information that is available and make it useful for folks on the ground. And you know, this will be iterative, and we'll refine things as we go forward. But we do want your input, and we're looking forward to hearing what you have to say and communicating with us better. So go ahead and go on to that next slide. So I did want to just, you know, reiterate the point that this is, we're developing this based upon guidance from the WO, and it does build upon the vulnerability assessments that you're going to hear more about here in just a second that have already been done in this region, and incorporates other existing efforts. And really, we want your feedback, and we want to know what it is that you're struggling with and what your needs are, so that we can create something that in the long run is beneficial for the region. And I think that's about all I had.
Great, thanks, Anita. So just as a reminder, this will be our schedule, and I believe we're still right on time. Before we start your presentation, Megan, I would just like to put up a quick poll for everyone, and we can get a bit of a temperature check for you know, what your preferred source of climate change adaptation information is. So you can take a second and look at the options there. And I believe you should be able to select multiple. So if you have a couple, three sources that you like, go ahead and reflect that. And your answers here are anonymous, so we don't know who said what. You should feel free to speak your mind without fear of judgment. And I can see that we've had about 3/4 of people answer, so I'll give you just a couple seconds longer. If you haven't participated, feel free to go ahead and do that. Okay, I'll go ahead and end here, and then I should be able to share those results, and you should see them now. So it looks like, you know, lots of folks have sources already that they're going to, including the regional climate coordinators and research station scientists, and academic researchers are probably the top three here, but quite a nice spread, which is great. So I'll go ahead and put this away, and then I'll introduce Megan Friggins, who is a research ecologist with the Rocky Mountain Research Station. And Megan, you should be able to share your screen when you're ready. And I believe you're muted.
So yes, let me reshare, because as soon as I shared it, all the Zoom stuff went away and I could not
Right.
unmute myself. Okay. Okay, so hopefully you're seeing a presentation right now. Title slide?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so yes, I have 10 minutes to talk about climate change vulnerability assessments in the Southwest. So the way I've organized this today is I'm going to give you a couple slides on a variety of topics, and I have a lot of links in there because I assume everybody will be able to access these slides later on. And so hopefully you don't worry too much if I whip through them. So let us begin. So everything that I'm talking about today really got started right around 2011, 2012, where the National Forest System started putting out these products, the National Roadmap for Responding to Climate Change, the Climate Change Scorecard, and Planning Role Framework, which all emphasized or started to talk about climate change. And in particular, or at least from my point of view, it really started to emphasize some of these climate change vulnerability assessments as an integral part of management planning. And that's not to say that climate change wasn't something that the Forest Service was looking at before this time, but this really formalized the process and had accounting into it. And so myself and several other scientists within the Rocky Mountain Research Station got together with folks from Region 3, Drac Tripke and others, and some university folks and the Nature Conservancy. There was a lot of people interested at this time in developing vulnerability assessment products. So one of the things that came out of this early recognition and kind of response to these mandates that were coming down was this GTR. And so this is the cover of the GTR, and here's a link, for example. And this was actually supported by the Western Wildland Environmental Threat Assessment Center. They provided some support to essentially review what the status of vulnerability assessments was in the Southwest, because it was seen as a need. We need to know what we have so we know what we need in the future. And so I have here the table of contents in quite some detail, but that's really for your reference later. Essentially, I think the important things to know is that there's chapters 1 through 3, which kind of talk about vulnerability assessments, what they are, how you conduct them. This is talking about this image here in the upper hand area about the different spatial and temporal scales that resources exist at and that might be targets of vulnerability assessments. And then in the bottom, we have that same spatial temporal scale for the types of tools that you may use to try to measure climate change impacts or vulnerability. The fourth chapter in this GTR talks about how you use this information and integrate it into adaptation plans. And really, this isn't a prescriptive document. It's more about describing what is out there and what others have done as demonstrating methods for this. The big emphasis, though, on this GTR is the fifth chapter, and this is a review of assessments to that period that cover the Southwest. And we found 36 assessments that fit a certain criteria, and they addressed a variety of resources, used a whole variety of methods, but still we were able to identify several common themes from all these assessments: the vulnerability of grasslands to things like invasive species, so kind of these indirect effects of climate change, a general expectation for a general decline in water availability, both within aquatic systems and upland systems. This notion or this idea that temperature alone can drive many of these changes. It's not just changes in precipitation. And that's somewhat important because we're able to predict with more certainty that there's going to be a certain level of temperature increase. Ecotones being more vulnerable. And then again, this theme across these studies that when you actually look at climate change projections, the future often looks very different from what we have seen historically. And this creates a challenge when you're trying to develop management plans, because you're planning for something that you have not seen yet, and it creates a certain level of uncertainty. We also looked at these climate change assessments to try to look for patterns of what they covered. And so this is a table that's out of there that shows, you know, animals, plants, both, water, kind of the scale within each of those categories, so species, habitat, ecosystems. and then the spatial scale too of these assessments. And so you can see they cover a range of things, but there's these huge gaps in here. And so one of the major conclusions of this assessment or review was that the majority of assessments that are out there focus on species, and that makes sense. That's often a management target. Those are often things that have regulatory implications, and the public's often interested in them. But we also noticed that there weren't any region-wide ecosystem assessments. And if you're trying to develop plans based on a vulnerability assessment, it needs to be in the same scale that you're planning for. So if you're trying to make a region-wide plan, you need a region-wide relevant vulnerability assessment. And so in a later talk today, Jack's going to introduce, I think, his all lands vulnerability assessment for the Southwestern region. And this really kind of addressed this shortcoming, or this gap, I guess we would say, in the literature. And so there's some good stuff there. Jack and I have also talked about this on some RMRS spotlights, and they have this series called Science You Can Use Bulletin and Science You Can Use in 5 minutes. And so these are links to those presentations, though you may be getting a more thorough presentation today on these topics. Something else that was developed out of the station around this time was a system for assessing vulnerability of species to climate change. This was also in response to Forest Service biologists, particularly in Region 3. We went to a meeting and this need not only to understand what the status was with respect to vulnerability assessments, but to be able to somehow organize all this information coming in about climate change for species in a way that would be useful for managers so that they could assess vulnerability. And so we created this tool. This is the shot of the GTR. The instruction manual provides background. It's a web-based tool where you can click boxes or whatever these are and get a score at the end. So you can access that through this website if you're interested. So the SAVE system is specific to terrestrial species, and it's a trait-based system. So it's based on characteristics of the species that relate to these elements of vulnerability, and also specific characteristics of the animals themselves. And so what you get out of using the SAVEs is a score that allows you to compare vulnerability amongst a suite of species and to drill down a little bit into what's driving that vulnerability. So it helps you organize the information and then assess how species are impacted by climate change. So since its creation, we've used the SAVE systems in a number of case studies and other analyses. And this slide is just meant to show you that you can use it in a variety of spatial scales and across the US. Having a trait-based system allows you to integrate a lot of flexibility into the system so that you can apply it to multiple different scenarios, and that was something that was really desired out of this tool. We've also integrated the SAVEs with species suitability, habitat suitability analysis, and formal risk assessment frameworks, and been able to better identify climate change impacts by integrating a trait-based system with these other ways to quantify impacts. So there's a lot of interesting stuff. You can contact me too if you're interested, and there's web pages about all this as well. Something more recent that we've been working on is ecosystem vulnerability assessment tool. And so this is not at the species level, but it's at ecosystems. And this is also a tool that's specifically meant to gauge climate fire interactions. And so what you're seeing here is a screenshot of the GTR for the fire climate vulnerability assessment tool. This, like the SAVEs, and I didn't talk about the collaboration that went into producing the SAVEs tool, but a large collaboration with managers and federal, non-federal researchers. This is a link to the actual GTR. There are many parts to this project, and you're going to have a presentation, I think, at the end of this series that talks about this a little bit more, and the larger Southwest Fire Climb project, and I have that link here. A little more about the tool, though, is it's somewhat similar to the SAVEs in that it uses predictors to quantify ecosystem vulnerability to climate-related changes in fire regimes. So it has these characteristics, and those drive the scoring. It's also meant to be a highly flexible tool. So vulnerability is defined as a departure from user-defined desired future conditions. This allows it to be used in a variety of scenarios and situations. We did not determine what bad is. The managers that are using this get to do that. This graphic is just showing you kind of some of the inputs. I know it's too small to see. You can look at the GTR if you're interested in this stuff. And this is showing you the way the outputs look. And these survivorship, erosion, debris flows, these are all the different specific characteristics. So you can get an overall score for your ecosystem, and then you can get scores for these individual components that help you drill down into what's driving vulnerability or lack of amongst ecosystems. So right now we're trying to finish up some case studies for the Santa Fe, Lincoln, and Bighorn National Forest. We do have this case study webpage. It just kind of describes what we're doing, and we hope to update that pretty soon with some final reports, and that's an exciting development. So finally, and hopefully I'm doing good on time here, other resources. And so I'm talking about things that I've worked with personally. I am located in Albuquerque. If you guys aren't familiar, I do work in the Southwest a lot, and I have worked with the region and other Forest Service regions as well. I've also worked with these larger, I guess, interagency groups, in particular the landscape conservation cooperatives, and they funded a couple efforts to kind of produce vulnerability assessment products as well. And so this first one, this website, Vulnerability of Aquatic Species and Their Habitats, was something that we developed in response to a request for, I think, multiple agencies. But if you go here, you find a map and you can click on, and this covers the entire Western US, you can click on individual states or regions, and you'll get a list, an annotated bibliography of any vulnerability assessment that deals with aquatic species and their habitats. And so it needs a few updates, but it's a great jumping off point if that's something of interest to you. We also were working on spatially explicit vulnerability assessments in a multi-agency collaboration, and I've been working on getting what are these massive reports and a lot of information published into journal publications. And so we have analyses for pinna juniper, native fish, riparian systems, and sagebrush, and we have finally gotten the pinna juniper out and are working on the riparian systems. And these assessments were conducted for the Four Corners and Upper Rio Grande region, but the framework is designed to be very flexible, and it's based on readily available spatial data. So you could really apply this anywhere. And now I think that you guys are already going to have a riparian assessment and things to take care of this, but this is just, you know, something else to I guess, highlight. These last three things are more clearinghouses, a USDA Forest Service Climate Change Resource Center. They're really focused on compiling adaptation related material, but they also talk about vulnerability assessments. They have a framework and structure and a lot of good examples that they're trying to make in an easily digestible format. The Adaptation Partnership, many of you being in the West are probably have been talking with Jessica Halowski and Peterson. They have been conducting vulnerability assessments and then developing these adaptation strategies for a number of regions. And I think some of their past efforts might be of interest, especially where they cover economics or recreation, because that seems to be a gap in many of the assessments we see out there, so worthwhile to check out. And this last one, it has the least to do with vulnerability assessments, but I want to point out the CCAS website because it's specific to the Southwest and it's specifically designed for managers. It's supposed to be this clearinghouse where you can go and see what other managers are doing and how, you know, what worked and what didn't work for them. There's a little bit of a positive bias, I think, in that a lot of them are success stories, but there's still lessons learned. And it's just if you're exploring, I think it's categorized by resource. If you're exploring a certain resource, it's worth going there and seeing if somebody else in a different agency has been working on that and what their story is. Okay, I am done. So I'll stop sharing.
Great, thank you, Megan. And as Amy wrote in the chat, we are holding questions to the end for folks to answer. I do think Megan has to leave us early for another meeting, but we will make sure questions you have get to her and get addressed going forward if you have specific things for her to answer. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Jack Tripke, who's the regional ecologist in Region 3. And also following Jack is going to be Michael Carpinelli, who's an ecologist on the Cibola National Forest. He's going to talk a little bit about applying some of the work that Jack did. So I'll hand it off to you, Jack. I can see your slides, but I cannot hear you. I think you might be muted.
Yeah. Okay, how about now?
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, hi folks. Want to acknowledge my partners here real quick. Max Wolff, who's on the call today, did most of the GIS work for this project, and also Esteban Moldavan at University of New Mexico. And this is kind of what I'll be covering. I'll touch on the agencies, the Forest Service Climate Adaptation Framework, and then get into the vulnerability assessment itself and the various facets of that work, and then end with how we're using that information. So these are the 6 components of the Forest Service Climate Adaptation Framework, including vulnerability assessment, and then followed by adaptation strategy, and then tactics at the project level, at the implementation level, and then part 4 is integrate and implement, monitor, and then learn and communicate, which includes the agency's climate change scorecard, which a lot of you are involved with. It's kind of our agency's way to see how forests and regions are doing with climate adaptation. So the overall goal of the vulnerability assessment was an all lands coverage of climate vulnerability for upland ecosystem types, what we call ecological response units, or ERUs. So that's all lands in Arizona and New Mexico. Specific objectives were to build from known vegetation climate relationships. We wanted it to be as quantitative as possible, and then result in a probability surface that we could plug into a GIS for spatial analyses. Some sideboards include compatibility with regional conventions and Forest Service conventions. Using existing observations, we didn't want to create new data. We wanted to lean on existing observational data. And then we sort of settled on a projection of 1 century. So the 30-year climate leading up to 2090 represents our future climate. So the textbook definition of vulnerability includes 3 elements, including exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. Our focus for our vulnerability assessment was on exposure and sensitivity. Exposure in terms of the future climate at 2090, and then sensitivity is represented by a climate envelope for each ERU. Adaptive capacity comes later in the process in the adaptation strategy that Max is working on now, and also in things like the socioeconomic vulnerability assessment that Allison Barker is working on now. You'll hear more about that here in a moment. But I think the take home from this slide is what we mean by probability, what we mean by vulnerability, which is the relative probability of type conversion, regardless of trigger, whether it's fire or something else, and whether it's gradual over time if there's no triggers involved. So this slide sort of sums up a lot of the GIS work. We created a polygon configuration across the 2 states, across Arizona and New Mexico. You're seeing a little snapshot there of it from northern New Mexico. Each one of those polygons represents areas of similar site potential. And into each one of those polygons, Max put information for the ecological response unit, the ERU, the 30-year climate leading up to 1990, the average for a number of different climate variables. And then the same climate variables at the year 2090. And then the vulnerability based on the departure between the difference between the climate at the year 2090 and the climate envelope for a particular ERU. And then uncertainty I won't talk much about today, but the way we assessed uncertainty between between 3 different global climate models and their projections. And I'll touch on that again here in a moment. So when I say climate envelope, I mean the mean climate condition plus or minus 2 standard deviations, which for a given ERU accounts for about 95% of the variability. So there's the resulting vulnerability surface, Arizona, New Mexico, symbolized on a scale of low to very high, where low is in green. We're saying that at the year 2090, a given spot on the ground is still within its historic climate envelope, still within plus or minus 2 standard deviations. In contrast to the other end of the spectrum, very high in red, which is 4 standard deviations and beyond at the year 2090. And then that table on the bottom kind of sums it up, all acres, all ERUs. And the take home there is that the majority of the area at the year 2090, we're predicting to have exceeded its historic climate envelope. And then uncertainty is kind of summed up in those 3 columns to the right. So low uncertainty means that all 3 global climate models were in agreement in results. And that came to 50%. So 50% of the area is in low uncertainty versus the other end of the spectrum, high uncertainty, 8%, where there was no agreement between the 3 global climate models. So I'm not going to cover all ERUs. I'm just going to use pinyon juniper as a demo of results. And so here are 5 different pinyon juniper types. And just want to point out that in all cases, the majority of the area we're predicting to have exceeded its historic climate envelope by the year 2090. The other thing I want to point out here is the difference between a cold type like PJ sagebrush, where vulnerability is very high, extremely high, in comparison to a mild type like PJ evergreen shrub, kind of the other end of the spectrum, where vulnerability is much lower. And then we had a phase for validation. You know, there's a lot of models floating around out there. Very few are validated, let alone with real world observations. So we kind of had decided that we were going to look at the pattern of our vulnerability predictions in relation to real world observations for a number of things, including fire severity. So that table on the bottom is a chi-square table, and the take home there is that in high vulnerability settings, there's a much lower incidence of stand replacement fire, contrary to our hypothesis, versus low vulnerability settings where there's a much higher incidence of stand replacement fire. And time permitting, we can talk about that here at the end. Another validation, another test that we looked at was the theorized migration of species moving upslope. And so here's another chi-square table. And basically what it's saying is high vulnerability sites are there's a much higher likelihood of species of lower life zones showing up, regenerating at a given site on in a high probability area versus a low probability area. A couple other things that we looked at that we haven't published. Actually, I just looked at this a couple of weeks ago, and I looked at authorized use patterns for range and range pastures from the records 1999 and beyond, and found that inactive pastures were there was a much higher likelihood that those fell into high plus vulnerability versus low vulnerability areas. And I haven't done any sleuthing to see what those to see what's going on there, but I thought I would include it today. And then one last validation that we looked at stream gauge data, long-term records on a few different watersheds. This summary, this slide is of the Upper Verde in central Arizona, is a moderate to high vulnerability area. And and then kind of looking at that in relation to changes in stream flow over time. And what we're seeing in recent decades is a decline in stream flow, but an increase in variability, as some scientists have theorized. So the number of low flow days is increasing, the number of high flow days is increasing, but the overall flow is going down. So some take-homes from all that. First and foremost, the majority of every ERU is to exceed its climate envelope. Vulnerability varies a lot by ERU and location. Northern New Mexico, by our predictions, has the lowest overall vulnerability of any subregion. Cold ecosystem types like the PJ sagebrush are much more vulnerable than other types, than mild types. Our validation suggests that the results are useful for highlighting vulnerability and underpinning an adaptation strategy. The results are useful for follow-on assessments, talk about that here in a moment, and that Southwest ecosystems are already being affected. No surprise there, but we can show with our predictions and observational data that ecosystems are already being affected. So how is this used? We're saying that the results are foundational to a regional climate adaptation strategy, that the results are can be used to inform forest plan revision and the development of forest plan components. And Michael Carpinelli is going to talk about some of that here in a minute. The results are being used to underpin follow-on assessments, including the socioeconomic vulnerability assessment that Allison's going to talk about. And recently, the results were used to inform shared stewardship in New Mexico and the revision of their forest action plan. We're using the results to help with a study on the Lincoln, where there are regeneration problems, even in fires going back into the 40s. And we're trying to separate effects of land use and climate change. And I just wanted to circle back to this. So this is the agency climate adaptation framework summarized, and the things that we're working on at the moment, including vulnerability assessment, adaptation strategy, and adaptation tactics that ERI is helping with for project level, for implementation level work. And then that last bullet that a lot of you are also working on, which includes the climate change scorecard, which again is our agency's way of sort of seeing how we're doing, kind of measuring how we're doing over time at the region and forest levels in terms of adaptation, climate adaptation. And that's it.
Thanks, Jack. Michael, if you're ready, you could be able to share.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Does anything show up there for you?
It does, yep. Looks great.
Okay, well, thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm just going to quickly point out some of the ways we on the CEBLA in our new forest plan are addressing climate with respects to vegetation. Right up front, we thought it was important to define a lot of words that are thrown about, resistance, resilience, and adaptation, because we repeatedly use those again throughout the plan and in the plan's environmental impact statement. Specifically, we mentioned that in our one desired condition that we looked at the vulnerability that Jack was talking about and how that relates to our desired conditions and what we expect in future under different climate change scenarios. So in areas of low vulnerability, we expect plant community composition to remain similar to its current map unit characteristics. And in areas of high vulnerability, we would expect that perhaps there would be a gradual realignment in response to climate change. And along with our plant components, we've got some management approaches. One ties into the synthesis that Jack has prepared, and I'll show you a glimpse of that later, which is the how-to for managers for each ERU specific in different environments and different climate change scenarios. And one of the management approaches refers to, one approach is to adjusting basal area to within the normal range of variation, but perhaps at the low end if it serves to minimize water stress, more as a preemptive approach to upcoming drier and warmer situations. And another situation we could foresee is perhaps managing where we favor early cereal species, say for example, in a dry mixed conifer vegetation type, which would be dominated by ponderosa pine and Douglas fir. We would manage more for the ponderosa pine, anticipating that it would be more pre-adapted to future drier, warmer climate scenarios than the Douglas fir, but at the same time maintaining that late cereal component as a seed source in locally wetter, cooler areas or north-facing slopes, so that we don't lose that component regardless of future climate change scenarios. And in the plan appendix, we have the synthesis that goes along with the climate change vulnerability assessment Jack referred to. And part of that, the synthesis shows for each ERU, and in this case, the specific geographic areas on the CEBLA National Forest, we've got the different treatment types over there on the right: shrub control, invasive control, fire, tree thinning as examples, and then the different themes for the different climate scenarios underneath them. Now these, I should point out, these themes might have different synonyms, but equivalent meanings in a more recent up-to-date version of the synthesis Jack may have available. So that's what we have in the plan. In the EIS for the plan, it's important that we point out the difference between two different strategies: mitigation and adaptation, where mitigation serves to reduce greenhouse gas sources and emissions, where adaptation relates more to we adjust to climate change. So mitigation is looking at the forest effect on the globe, and adaptation is looking at the effects of global climate change on the forest. And part of the affected environment write-up in the vegetation portion of the EIS looks at an overall summary of the different characteristics of our vegetation types. One of those being climate, where we want to highlight, again, bring the reader back to the assessment that came out of the Jack's climate change assessment vulnerability, the vulnerability assessment report. And that ties back into our priorities for the different ERUs and how we would serve to manage them in the future. And that is all I had for the CEBLA's plan and EIS.
Thanks, Michael. It's helpful, I think, to see how you all have applied that. So next we have Allison Barker. Allison's an economist with U.S. Forest Service Enterprise. And Allison, you should be able to share your screen when you're ready.
Hello, everyone. I think you can see my screen. Let me pull it up so I can also see my screen.
I can see it.
Excellent. Yeah, I'm going to talk about socioeconomic vulnerability. My name's first on this. So I'm an economist with Enterprise. I actually sit over on the diagonal from you guys in Vermont, but I've done a lot of work on plan revision and more recently FORFRI and some other projects. So it's fun to see. I know a lot of names on this call. So hello, everyone. Yeah, my name's first on this slide, mostly because I made the slide. This project idea was brought to me by Ken and Jack in your region, and Anita joined when she joined as the climate coordinator in your region. And so a lot of the heavy lifting was already done when we kicked off this project. This was born from an existing GTR that looks at the socioeconomic vulnerability on national grasslands in Arizona and New Mexico. This was published in September of 2018. And the task we undertook was to expand this work to cover, expand it beyond the Forest Service boundaries to cover all land in the Southwest. And so the idea was to expanding this socioeconomic vulnerability look would support work with state partners, shared stewardship. And Ken also suggested that, since we're going to expand this work, we're going to have to look for some new data, new indicators once we leave Forest Service land. Let's also try to get some indicators at a sub-county level. So often socioeconomic work uses counties as the default geographic scale because data is readily available and it's reliable at that scale. We use a lot of survey data, and so counties provide a reliability level. But sub-county level variation is hidden, and this is especially concerning when we're talking about vulnerable populations. And so in the interest of time, I'm going to very quickly illustrate each of these three components of vulnerability and how we think about it from the socioeconomic perspective: exposure, sensitivity, adaptive capacity. One slide on each, and then I have a fourth slide which will illustrate the combination of those three components. So the first section of the report, it's forthcoming, so you'll all see it someday soon, hopefully, is it presents exposure to ecological change. And from a socioeconomic perspective, we care about ecological change because it impacts the provision of ecosystem services. Can I point here? Yeah. So we're following directly on the work that Jack just presented. And so we've took his very detailed probability surface and summarized it down to back up to a county level likelihood of vegetation change as that ecological change indicator. And then here I'm showing you on the vertical axis, I have a number of beef, cattle, sheep, and goat farms. And that's a proxy or an indicator for the use of forage. So forage as the ecosystem service. If anyone knows a lot about the number of farms, I've actually truncated this vertical axis. We have a few counties that have thousands of farms that have been cut off, so you can see detail. But as we move in the northeast direction, we're increasing in exposure of ecosystem service. In this particular picture, I'm showing forage as the ecosystem service. The next component is sensitivity. And so we're going to think of sensitivity as an economic dependence on these ecosystem services. Another ecosystem service is the provision of forest products. And our economic dependence, the indicator I'm using here is employment. This is what's called a location quotient, but it's really just showing the concentration of employment in the timber and forest product sectors. Darker colors have a higher concentration relative to the state average, and lighter colors have a lower concentration of employment relative to the state average. So these are relative within states. The third component is adaptive capacity. Adaptive capacity is the ability to adjust or adapt to responses in response to change in ecosystem services. So household socioeconomic conditions such as poverty, unemployment, income, education, other observable characteristics are associated with that ability to adapt to change. So here I'm presenting the Center for Disease Control has created this social vulnerability index. The GTR that we're building off of did create an adaptive capacity index at the county level. And so we're presenting this here so as not to repeat that, that's already in the GTR, but also because this adaptive capacity index offers us a look at a sub-county level. And you can see there is variation in this index across counties, especially these large counties we find, which would be camouflaged at a county level. And so we have a more detailed detailed look at resilience or adaptive capacity. And so if you take away one thing today, maybe not one thing, but one thing to note is that this index exists. You can Google it, but I'll talk more in a second. But I've been seeing it come up more and more in other work that I've done. I've talked about it with colleagues, and so I know that it's been implemented into some aspects of FORFRI, for example. This index is readily available. And so finally, here is one way to think about the intersection of exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. Here for exposure, I have that likelihood of vegetation change that Jack's work, that builds on Jack's work. Over here, I have sensitivity as a watershed, so water being another ecosystem service. This watershed importance index is based on forest to faucets data, which you're probably familiar with. And then the size of these bubbles are adaptive capacity. And here I'm showing actually larger bubbles have lower adaptive capacity. So as we move again in this northeast direction, we're increasing in exposure, increasing in sensitivity, and larger bubbles are increasing in or decreasing in adaptive capacity. So, up here we have the more vulnerable counties. In this case, we're looking at relative to counties. And I should also mention that I have truncated these axes so you can see these names. We're missing some that are off in this direction. So I kind of have two main takeaways. I think one is that there is readily available data. As I mentioned, you can Google it, but we've made it easier by summarizing all of the indicators that we've looked at, summarizing them to the county and census tract level, and that will be in an appendix to this forthcoming report. The GTR that we built off of has a similar appendix with forest management unit level data. And then the second takeaway is that you care about this readily available data because this work really is intended to illustrate that relationship between ecological change, ecosystem services, and socioeconomic well-being. So these indicators across three components describe ways in which people or communities are impacted by ecological changes and the degree of dependence that they may have on ecosystem services. Yeah, I think that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Allison. That's really interesting to see some of that data, and I think we're looking forward to seeing that report. Next, I want to introduce Max Wolff. He's a fire ecologist, also with Enterprise. Max, you should be able to share your screen.
All right, let me know, Bryce, if it's coming up here.
Yep, I can see it.
Okay, so like Bryce said, I'm an ecologist with the Enterprise program, and I currently sit in Portland, Oregon, which is a little different than the climate you guys have down there in Arizona and New Mexico. But I spent a lot of my days and a lot of my career in the Southwest and really understand the sort of different value and importance of those systems. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this aquatic and riparian climate change vulnerability assessment that we've put together, and talk about some of the guts of it and some of the outcomes, okay? So the goals of this assessment were to develop a quantitative climate change vulnerability assessment, and it's designed as a companion to the previously completed terrestrial climate change vulnerability assessment. That's what Jack was just presenting on a minute ago. This assessment recognizes the unique nature of these riparian and aquatic systems, and also recognizes their outsized importance, especially in your southwestern climates. We chose a quantitative vulnerability assessment here as a means of evaluating comparative risk across the landscape and among resources. This work builds directly off of the work that Max Smith and Megan Friggins, she mentioned it earlier, developed in their spatially explicit and quantitative vulnerability assessment of cold water fish habitat and riparian corridors in the Intermountain West. So we took their framework and modified it to address some of the warm water, aquatic, and riparian resources that are really important in the southwestern landscapes. And we added some additional changes to it. Also, specifically, we changed the scoring of individual metrics to favor selected scaled continuous variables over binary metrics. And that was to account for incremental impacts in these systems. The spatial extent of this work included all ownerships and all lands in Arizona and New Mexico. And then we also analyzed select watershed groupings in Oklahoma and Texas, basically those places intersecting the national grasslands administered by the southwestern region. In order to accommodate our different scales of influence and relative importance, the data generated for this assessment is designed for reporting and scoring at multiple scales. But we did design it with sort of the smallest reporting unit as 6 field subwatersheds. In total, this meant we rated about 6,700 watersheds. And I should note that we didn't have full data for all of the watersheds across the entire analysis area. So folks using the data should use caution, especially when comparing watersheds that don't have the same inputs, a differing number of inputs. So a little bit about the overall approach here, and you've heard a lot about this in previous presentations, but climate change vulnerability assessments typically evaluate a system setting in terms of exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. So exposure is that magnitude of climate change as well as climate-related phenomena, for example, fire and floods. Sensitivity evaluates the response of systems to and settings to exposure. And then finally, adaptive capacity reflects the ability of the system or setting cope with negative impacts. Both sensitivity and adaptive capacity are traits or conditions that predict how a system or setting will respond to the disturbance. This assessment evaluates both cold water fish habitats as well as warm water, aquatic, and riparian habitats throughout the Southwest. This is done to evaluate the different indicators and metrics importance to each of these 2 system types. In this assessment, we also highlight and evaluate indicators and metrics both in terms of intrinsic and expressed vulnerabilities. And so for our purposes, intrinsic variables represent baseline vulnerabilities, those that have vulnerability even in the absence of climate change, for example, diversion density. And then our climate expressed variables are those that are exacerbated directly by climate change, such as changes in flow volume and timing or changes in water temperature. So to take a look at what this means, we'll start with the cold water fish habitat and exposure. A total of 7 metrics were used in describing this cold water fish habitat exposure. These included road crossing density, diversion density, and wildfire risk for our intrinsic variables. And then our climate expressed variables included predicted change in annual and summer stream volume, predicted change in stream temperature, and upland or terrestrial vulnerability rating for each watershed. And that came directly from that work Jack presented a minute ago. It should be noted here that wildfire risk was evaluated here as an intrinsic risk, but we recognize that contemporary and predicted climate change is expected to exacerbate wildfire hazard and associated risk. So the graphics that you're seeing here represent composite values across variables, and the watersheds that you see depicted in red have lower or worse ratings than those shown in blue. Also want to point out that many of the watersheds depicted in these graphics for the cold water fish habitat do not have suitable cold water fish habitat, even under contemporary or historic climates. And they're not masked in these slides, but the final rankings and reportings don't include the cold water variables. So looking at cold water sensitivity, we evaluated that based on the presence or absence of cold water threatened and endangered fish habitat in the watershed. And then our adaptive capacity included 5 indicators: contemporary water temperature, presence of springs, wetlands, or groundwater dependent ecosystems, subsurface heterogeneity, which we measured as karst or pseudokarst present in the watershed, beaver dam capacity, or a measure of potential beaver dam capacity, and percentage of land in each watershed that was in some form of protected status. So when you put those together, we can generate what we call an impact score, which is calculated for each watershed by combining the exposure and sensitivity metrics and that's on the upper left of your slide here. The impact score is a measure of the combined magnitude and sensitivity to the changing climate. And then we also rate adaptive capacity, and that represents the ability of the system to cope with the exposure. So we can measure and plot each watershed in terms of both their impact score and adaptive capacity as relative measures, as you can see in the upper right-hand side of this slide. And this is important because not all vulnerability is the same. And understanding a watershed's adaptive capacity is really useful in determining where a system is naturally more resistant. And also these areas may represent management investment opportunities. So finally, we can put it all together and see how the watersheds across the full assessment area compare to one another, accounting for all those measures of exposure and sensitivity and adaptive capacity. And again, I just want to note that we're looking at cold water habitats in this slide, and they're not present across the full landscape. So feel free to sort of edit with your eye. But the warm water and aquatic riparian habitats are applicable region-wide, and we'll talk about that next. So you'll see a lot of parallels here, but with the warm water, aquatic, and riparian habitat, we used the following for our exposure metrics. And again, when we're looking at these slides, the watersheds depicted in red, those have lower or worse ratings than those shown in blue. So our intrinsic indicators for warm water and riparian habitats were groundwater use, major dams in the watershed, and wildfire risk. And then our climate expressed variables here, they also included those predicted changes in flow volume and temperature, though we used a different temperature threshold. But we also are adding here a metric for predicted change in the timing of flow to account for those altered hydrographs and the peakiness that I was talking about a minute ago. For our warm water, aquatic, and riparian sensitivity, we evaluated based on the presence or absence of the riparian and or warm water T&E species in the watershed. And then our warm water, aquatic, and riparian adaptive capacity utilized 4 indicators. Those were presence of springs, that same subsurface heterogeneity we talked about before, the percentage of each watershed with natural cover, and then also the percentage of land in protected status, like we carried for the cold water. And then again, like we talked about with the cold water systems, here we can see the impact score on the upper left juxtaposed with our adaptive capacity score in the lower right. And taken together for each watershed, we can understand sort of both the magnitude of potential impact and the potential resiliency or adaptive capacity of those systems. And then this is what that looks like all together for the warm water, aquatic, and riparian habitat vulnerability rating. And so this provides a composite comparative metric across all watersheds for the region. So you can get a sense of where the most vulnerabilities are present in a watershed and the least adaptive capacity is in a given watershed. So what do we do with all this data? Well, we believe that there are a lot of potential uses and applications for this assessment, and we're excited about folks getting a chance to dig into it and use it. But here are a few of the key take-home messages I wanted to leave you guys with today. In general, the exposure side of the equation is driven by the flow volume metrics, as opposed to the temperature metrics. This means that there's an opportunity to employ mitigation and adaptation strategies that are designed to enhance base flow and moderate flow extremes. It's also apparent from this assessment that forest system lands have a high adaptive capacity in relation to the adjacent lands. So I think this represents a real opportunity, and investments in restoration, enhancement, and protection of these lands is really imperative. When we think generally about mitigation and adaptation strategies, many of the best management practices apply, including restoring functioning wetlands and floodplains by promoting natural sinuosity, enhancing water storage, and promoting structure to dissipate energy. These aquatic and riparian ecosystems will only face further threats and pressures as the climate continues to change. So we should focus our efforts and protect and enhance what we have. We should identify potential refugia at multiple scales and prioritize our work in areas of relatively higher adaptive capacity to ensure efficacy and longevity of our work. That's really all I have. For those that are interested in utilizing this data, we're preparing a final report. It's currently in development, and it'll be available along with data, spatial data for all of the indicators and metrics. Feel free to reach out to myself or Jack Tripke with any questions.
Great, thank you, Max. And our last presentation today will be a team of presenters. Andy Thode, professor at NAU and principal investigator with the Southwest Fire Science Consortium, Ariel Leonard, forest planner on the Kaibab National Forest, and Valerie Stein Foster, wildlife program manager, also on the Kaibab. And Andy has already started screen sharing. Okay, looks great, Andy. Thank you. Oh, I can't hear you.
I unmute, huh?
Yeah.
And all of a sudden I can't find my control to turn on my video because it was hidden behind everything else. I was so on the ball for a minute. Well, I don't know. I can't find it. It's just disappeared. Oh, there it is. Sorry about that. Okay. Come on. There we go. Hello, everybody. So I'm Andy Thode. I'm faculty at Northern Arizona University, and I have this project called Southwest Fire Climb, funded by the Joint Fire Science Program, where we really tried to take a look at climate change and fire in the Southwest and develop some pathways and tools for managers and some new science via modeling that hopefully is helpful on the ground. I will point you directly to our southwestfireclimb.org website, which has information, a whole bunch of detailed webinars, all our deliverables and papers and GTRs and things available there. The major goals of that project were to evaluate how fire regimes may shift due to changing climate across the Southwest landscapes, to model potential ecological impact of these changes with treatments, both through Fire BGC and Landis 2, and also with vulnerability analysis, and to establish ways that managers may address these impacts. So there's really 4 pieces to Southwest Fire Climb. The first was the science synthesis piece, which has resulted in an annotated bibliography that's online and searchable from our website. And it's a little different than a lot of other annotated bibliographies. It actually lets you search by interactions between climate and fire regimes, different fire regime attributes, and then different fire regime attributes and ecosystem effects that happen there. So it's a little bit different search. It also lets you search in a kind of a standard way an annotated bibliography would, but it has those connections between climate, fire regimes, and ecosystem effects. We did a vulnerability analysis, which I think Megan Friggins hit on earlier today. And so I won't spend too much time on that, but we do have a fire climate vulnerability analysis for basically gaming different climate and treatment actions that can be done. And then we have our climate management modeling, which again, I mentioned we used Fire BGC and Landis 2 on 2 different landscapes in the Southwest to look at ecosystem effects. And we have a paper out on that and a number of presentations on that if you want, just a short and sweet of what we found. And then the last is this fire climate adaptation menu. And this is something that we worked with the folks at NIAX about to develop sort of this menu of strategies and tactics that you can use depending on what's appropriate and what you're trying to do on your landscape. So to talk a little bit more about that, I'm going to back up just a little bit to this adaptation process that Chris Swanston and others had come up with in the past, where you define your project, you assess the climate change impacts and vulnerabilities. With that, you use vulnerability assessments, the scientific literature, any other resources you have to input into what your situation is, and then evaluate your objectives and what you want in the future, and then figure out how to get there with different adaptation approaches, monitor and repeat. Our project with Southwest Fire Climb really addresses that second stage of assessing through both the science synthesis, the vulnerability analysis, and the modeling. And then this last piece, the fire climate adaptation menu, really comes in that identifying approaches to be actually do on the ground that allow you to start to plan for climate change and fire. This is just a few that, the tip of the strategies. We have 10, it may be going to 12. We're working on the publication on it right now, but these are all available on our website. There's strategies, approaches, and tactics. The tactics aren't shown here. They're the kind of nitty gritty, what can you do on the ground? And these tend to range from the realm of resistance, resilience, and transition strategies. So are you going to try and resist climate change and have ecosystems and the process of fire work as it is? Are you going to have the resiliency, or are you really trying to figure out how do we transition in the most graceful possible way in certain places on these landscapes? And it may be that in one project, you're actually working across all three of those in different places. We did test the fire climate menu in a workshop that was collaborative with the NIAX folks and the Kaibab National Forest on their CAPERP project. And that tested our menu and also ideally, hopefully, helped the Kaibab folks think about how they can work some of these climate change adaptation pieces into their fire management on the ground. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to Valerie and Ariel.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Just check in, and just to let you know, I got a text from Ariel, and she was having some technical issues, but we'll see where she's at in a few minutes. So hi everyone, I'm Valerie Stein-Foster, forest biologist for the Kaibab, and I'm just going to take a few minutes to highlight some things from the forest perspective about the Fire Climb workshop and the tools that we used and kind of developed. So one of the benefits of the workshop we had earlier this year is that it really got everyone in the room talking and thinking about how to integrate climate resiliency into a real world on the ground project on our forest. And, you know, we had specialists from different resource areas, program managers, a line officer, and key partners kind of all at the table at the same time discussing these things and thinking critically about them, which is beneficial in and of itself in terms of developing the Fire Climb menu and a product that would be really responsive to many of the issues and concerns you know, that we deal with here in the Southwest. And so the menu that we developed, you know, was developed with local input, and but you know, complements and can be used with the existing peer-reviewed approach, the adaptation workbook that Andy was just referring to a couple slides ago, that was developed by the NIAX folks. And so, you know, that structured process helps to ensure we're including best available science and climate resiliency into project planning using that kind of stepwise process. And, you know, this Fire Climb menu that we worked on collaboratively, you know, adds some additional strategies that speak a bit more to the Southwestern and Western forests and some of the issues that we face that are unique to our ecosystems. And then one other piece I just want to kind of touch on a little bit, you know, there's 5 kind of steps as part of that structured process. There's also that kind of final step of monitoring effectiveness of implemented actions, which really kind of closes that adaptive management feedback loop and is key to kind of continued learning. And then I just wanted to also point out that by using the workbook and this process and the Fire Climb menu, we help meet the intent of the 2012 planning rule, which is to ensure an adaptive land management planning process that is inclusive, efficient, collaborative, and science-based to promote healthy, resilient, diverse, and productive national forests and grasslands. Next slide, please, Andy. All right, and so then just quickly here, I just kind of wanted to highlight some of the benefits of using the adaptation workbook and the associated Fire Climb menu in the context of, you know, the NEPA process. So it's very transparent. It's grounded in BASI, as I mentioned earlier, and you know, it allows us to include strategies during project planning on the front end that can help to minimize or eliminate the potential for negative effects during project implementation. For example, several wildlife-related strategies that we developed through the workshop include maintaining or creating refugia, prioritizing sensitive or at-risk communities, and increasing habitat connectivity, structural diversity, and tree age size classes. So these are all things that can help ensure key habitat characteristics and ecological conditions for wildlife are provided for longer term in the context of climate change. And then the other thing I just want to mention is because it's a structured process that's documented and included as part of that project record, it's very transparent, and it can also help, it can help us apply what we learned to new projects and use the long-term monitoring to see maybe what's working and what's not. And so we can use these projects over time as proof of concept that maybe other forests in the region or in other regions can potentially reference during their own project development. So this structured kind of purposeful process can really help to institutionalize collective learning over time and incorporating climate resiliency into a project planning, design, and implementation. And then the only other thing I might mention is related to that is that the climate response framework does maintain a website of demonstration projects that show how different projects across the country are incorporating climate resiliency into their projects. And most of those are centered in the mid-Atlantic and eastern states right now, but I think there is one lonely dot in California, and so maybe we'll be able to eventually get some more projects in the West up there as well. And I think that covers just about what I had to say. And I'm not sure if Ariel is on. She was going to just mention a few things about the climate scorecard, but if she's not on, maybe I think Andy, you might. Okay. Andy, did you have a closing slide that you wanted to finish up with?
Sure, if we have a minute. I just wanted to talk a little bit about a new effort that's happening that kind of came out of Southwest Fire Climb in this workshop, and seeing that there's a lot of players in the fire and the climate world that aren't talking to each other, and that really need to be. And so we're really trying to create this new Southwest Fire and Climate Roundtable. I don't know if that's what we'll end up calling it. But we have these all these partners lined up, and we are working on pulling this together and starting to have quarterly meetings so that the right hand knows what the left hand is doing, and so that we can start to make workshops and things like this, leverage these and make them go a little further even.
Excellent. Thanks, Andy. That was great information from you both about fire climb, and then Valerie, your experience with the application of that in the workshop. And then I know we are at ERI are excited for this greater roundtable. I really want to provide a big thank you to our presenters. They were challenged to present a lot of information in a really short amount of time. So a big thanks to you all for those presentations. And I want to offer the opportunity now for folks to ask any questions that they may have had as those presentations were happening. And if you were holding back questions and wanted to ask anything of our presenters now, it would be great for you to provide those. I know that there might be a lot of questions. I hear that someone says they have about 4 questions for Jack. We have just a little more than 10 minutes left. So I don't know that we'll have a lot of time for discussion, but yeah, please put your questions forward. We can start with this one. Jack, there's a question, and I think Jack is still here, about expanding on the slide that showed reduced risk of stand replacement, even with high vulnerability to climate change.
That's right. So our hypothesis, briefly, our hypothesis was that fire severity would go up with vulnerability, that there ought to be a pattern there, but it was the reverse. And it turns out we're not alone. So there's a couple other studies in the literature, and they're looking at vulnerability, and they're kind of zeroing in on fuel production as one of the explanatory variables. In other words, the most vulnerable sites, all else being equal, are generating less fuel, and then maybe there's a connection between that and subsequent fire severity.
And as people put questions into the chat, I just want to go ahead and put forth one more poll. This is part of, us soliciting feedback from you all about what types of climate education might be helpful for you. And you should be able to choose multiple if multiple of those options speak to you. And then Jack, there's a question in the chat about how this applies to ERUs, and there's a number of questions. Do you see those?
Yeah. So the first question, maybe we do not have time for all of this, but does this change the TUI? I don't think so. I don't think this changes the TUI. One of the advantages of terrestrial ecological unit inventory is they're basing it on site potential and the environmental variables that come to play in favoring one vegetation type over another, and that's kind of a big part of that was a big premise in our vulnerability assessment. And we also acknowledge that site potential shifts over time. Those environmental variables on a given site, whether it's climate or changing soil condition or something else, that those shift over time. Site potential changes with it, and we know that TUI is responsive to that, and we can use that to underpin some of the assessments that we do, including the vulnerability assessment, is my opinion.
Thanks, Jack. You should be able to see the results from that poll about what types of climate education will be helpful. And so it looks like the highest one is the adaptation strategies and tactics for managers, and that's great because that is something that that we're working on, that Region 3 is working on with Enterprise, and that ERI is helping with, as Jack mentioned earlier, specifically on tactics for managers. And there are some other options here that we certainly could help facilitate, such as peer learning from other units and regions, and providing location-specific information and just basic Climate 101 type information. So here's another question. In vulnerability assessments, what is the smallest unit of measure? And I imagine there are several of our presenters that could potentially address this.
Yeah, throw out my 2 cents. We used departure in terms of standard deviation from a mean climate condition, according to about 5 or 6 climate variables. But it could be any number. I know that Max, for instance, is looking at other things with the aquatic riparian vulnerability assessment.
Okay, well, we need to wrap up here, but I just wanted to let you all know what our next steps would be and how we plan to engage you moving forward. So as we mentioned at the beginning, and then this was mentioned in Jack's presentation, but Region 3 is currently working on a climate adaptation strategy with Enterprise, and that's in development, and that's something that we'd like to engage you and get your input on, as Anita mentioned. And we'd also like to engage you to have some of those conversations, like Valerie mentioned, the conversations that they had around fire climb and adaptation menus. And this is obviously not the best venue for that. These big web meetings are difficult for everyone to have their 2 cents. So we are hoping to engage folks in smaller meetings. And so I have one more poll with respect to that, which is, how would you like to discuss adaptation strategies? What makes the most sense for you? Is that by discipline or resource area? So water folks talking to water folks. Is that by geography? So maybe, all of the kind of fry, those ponderosa pine forests are talking because they're kind of in this geographical region that's all similar. Or is it by unit? So are we staying within the unit within the forest, and you're talking with your peers? And we do hope to get folks together in the spring for some of these smaller meetings. And by together, I mean online, because I think that's still where we'll be. And to have some of these conversations about adaptation strategies. So that poll is still up. If you haven't responded, we'd love your feedback. We also have a survey, and I know we don't want to ask too much of you, but we really appreciate any feedback you have. And this survey in particular has some more open-ended questions. So maybe we didn't get to have that open discussion today in this meeting, but this particular survey, and I'm putting the link in the chat, has some open-ended questions where you can provide us with your thoughts on what you heard today, and what you'd like to hear about more of in the future, and what information you might need. So that's something that we would really like to hear from you all is, we've had these great presentations today and a lot of information. How is that information speaking to you, and what additional information might you need? I really appreciate all the input we've had so far, and the folks who are talking in the chat. Do any of our speakers have anything else to add?
Just thanks for everyone taking the time.
Yeah, same here. I just wanted to say thank you, Bryce, for running the meeting and for all your work, and to ERI, other folks in ERI. I just wanted to say a big thank you for all that you've done.
Well, and thank you all, and an extra thanks again to our presenters. I'll put that survey link in the chat one more time, and we will email that out in addition to presentations that people provide to us, so you can have all those links and all that info. And thank you all for your participation.
Thank you, Bryce. Bryce, is it too late to show that results of the last poll again? Somehow I missed it. Oh, you're on mute.
I can send it to you.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.